Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to D.G.Wills Books in La Jolla, California. Today we're honored to have Professor Yunte Huang here to discuss his new book, Inseparable, the original Siamese twins and their rendezvous with American history. Yunte Huang is a Guggenheim Fellow and a professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's the author of Trans-Pacific Imaginations and Charlie Chan, which won the 2001 Edgar Award and which was a finalist for the 2010 National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography. Having come of age in China as a student at the time of Tiananmen Square, Professor Huang now lives and teaches at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Now his wonderful new book. I don't know if any of you saw him interviewed by Brian Lamb on C-SPAN or heard the interview with Terry Gross on Fresh Air and National Public Radio. They were wonderful, and you can see those online. Let me say something briefly about the book. With wry humor, Shakespearean profundity, and trenchant insight, Yunte Huang brings to life the story of America's most famous 19th century Siamese twins. Nearly a decade after his triumphant Charlie Chan biography, Yunte Huang returns with this long-awaited portrait of Chang and Eng Bunker, who lived from 1811 until 1874. There were twins who were conjoined at the sternum by a band of cartilage and a fused liver, who were discovered in Siam by a British merchant in 1824. Bringing an Asian American perspective to this almost implausible story, Huang depicts the twins arriving in Boston in 1829, first as museum exhibits, but later as financially savvy showmen who gained their freedom and traveled the back roads of rural America to bring entertainment to the Jacksonian mobs. Their rise from subhuman freak show celebrities to rich Southern gentry, their marriage to two white sisters, resulting in 21 children, and their owning of slaves is here not just another sensational biography, but a Hawthorne-like excavation of America's historical penchant for finding feast in the abnormal, for tyrannizing the other, a tradition that, as Huang reveals, becomes inseparable from American history itself. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Yunte Huang.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Thank you all for coming out on such a nice Sunday afternoon. And I guess most of you know D.G.Wills, the bookstore, is really the center of the universe, and especially true for me. And I'd love to think, about almost a decade ago, as you see the blurb on the back cover of my book, that really indicates my editor's impatience. When is the next book? When is the book? Etc. But anyway, so 2010, when Charlie Chan came out, I did an event here with a lot of you guys in attendance, and it was covered on C-SPAN, and I would like to think this is really the beginning of my career as a public speaker and author. And anyway, so you guys may probably know the basics of the original Siamese twins, Chang and Eng, but let me just summarize very briefly for the sake of those who are not familiar with us. Amazing stories. They were born in Siam. They were actually Chinese, despite the fact they called Siamese twins. Siamese twins was really an American brand when they were brought to the United States and England, and their owners came up with this kind of brand to market them. And they were born to a Chinese father who was a fisherman. Actually, as coming from Canton. Again, my little knowledge of Cantonese or Chinese dialects helped me in this regard to determine in what province they possibly have migrated from. So their father was Chinese and their mother was half Chinese and half Siamese. That will make them about 3/4 Chinese and 1/4 Siamese. But at any rate, at birth, they were joined together by a band which was about 4 inches in length, and over wear and tear over the years, and it was eventually stretched to about 5.5 inches in length. And that fact is kind of important to their story because it limits the possibilities of their physical movement and how we can negotiate. It's like putting two people in a small room. You can't play basketball apparently, and or ping pong for that matter. So there are possibilities. At any rate, they grew up quite, just like normal kids. If you don't know the band, connecting them, you will think these are just two country boys growing up. They're healthy. They learn to walk, and they learn how to swim together, which is kind of hard thing to do. But at any rate, unfortunately, they lost their father when they were pretty young. There was a cholera epidemic, and they lost their father and some of their siblings as well. But their mother survived, and one of their elder brother survived, and a sister. And so they had to help their mother eke out a living, and they raised ducks, and they would sell duck eggs, Chinese salted duck eggs, which is a kind of delicacy. And but they learned to trade quite early, basically forced by that situation in life. And the ability to trade was very important to them later on, especially when they had to trade their body. I wouldn't think they're like Stormy Daniel or anything, selling their body for money. But it's a fact that they have to exhibit their bodies later on in order to make a living. When they were about 13, they were swimming in the river one day, and a traveling Scottish businessman by the name of Robert Hunter saw them. So he, in the twilight, he saw something kind of mysterious flapping in the water, and he thought that's something kind of mysterious, almost like a creature coming out of Greek mythology, like two heads, one body, just flapping in the water. And he came closer and realized, oh, it's actually two boys joined together. As a businessman, he immediately sensed a great business opportunity. So he convinced the boys, sweet-talked, and then also convinced their mother to let him take the boys out of the country and show them to the world. Unfortunately, the Siamese king did not approve, and he wanted to own everything. So he had to put aside the plan for a few years until one day he met an American ship captain by the name of Abel Coffin. And Coffin was the captain of an Nantucket-based merchant ship. And Coffin, of course, if you are familiar with Herman Melville, Moby Dick, Peter Coffin was the innkeeper. And Coffin was a very reputable New England name. Coffin, he just arrived in Siam, and he brought about 1,000 guns as a gift for the Siamese king, and who was fighting a bitter war with its neighbors at the time, with Siam's neighbors at the time. And so the 1,000 guns, really stood Abel Coffin in the king's good stead. And so Hunter and Coffin joined forces together and convinced the king by appealing his sense of vanity. And you can imagine next Tuesday or Monday, there's something going to happen in Singapore, appealing to the sense of vanity of the king. And so basically the pitch was that if you allow us to take the boys out of the country and show the world, then the people in the world will know how wonderful your kingdom is, that is able to produce such wonder boys. And the king said, okay, that's not a bad idea. So he let them go. So on April Fool's Day, 1829, Cheng and Anne left Siam. Before the departure, they were tricked into signing a handwritten contract, which will oblige them, basically. They were basically sold to Hunter and Coffin for $500. So their mother was paid $500, and the contract also dictates that the boys will be taken, anywhere their owners want them to go for at least 5 years. So at least it was a fine print, kind of tricky term, right? And which kind of basically bound them, contractually bound them. It's sort of like an NDA today, right? Non-disclosure agreement. But anyway, so it took them about 4.5 months to travel from Bangkok to Boston, from B&B. And I try to track, their movement, especially their arrival. Thanks to Ancestry.com and National Archives and everything today, we can actually track a lot of the passengers coming and going if you know the ship, the dates, and their names. So I looked up Sacken, arriving in Boston on that August day in 1829. Turns out there were only 2 passengers on the ship manifest. There was Robert Hunter, a merchant, and there was a Chinese man, age 17, who's actually a neighbor of the twins. Because their mother were worried. They were only 17 when they left Siam. They arrived in Boston, they were 18. Their mother were worried about them, and so she sent along a neighbor who's also about the same age to travel along with them. So where were the twins? Apparently they were smuggled through the customs. And that was not really unique, because a few years down the road, P.D. Barnum, the Prince of Humbugs, when he discovered so-called General Tom Thumb, the 25-inch dwarf, and Barnum sent General Tom Thumb to England. Tom Thumb actually passed through the British custom by disguising himself as a suckling baby in his mother's arms, because Barnum did not want anybody to have a free peek at the curiosity. So the twins, in almost same way, was smuggled through the customs. But they were immediately put on display. Initially, they were called the monster. The bill says the monster, the poster. But the owners thought that was probably too much, and because seeing them was already shocking enough. And what Freud would call uncanny, in a sense. You're talking to two boys standing in front of you. They are absolutely normal human beings if you don't see the connecting joint. And so the owners thought that's good enough, really shocking enough. So they were exhibited, put on display in Boston, moving on to Rhode Island, and then New York, and then Philadelphia, and then taken to England for about 1.5 years. And all these 2 or 3 years, they were basically treated like slaves, and the owners really pocket a lot of money. And the twins were very resentful of that fact. They're being exploited like slaves. So they eventually, when they turned 21 in 1832, they took advantage of the fact that Captain Coffin was constantly overseas for business, was the ship captain, and leaving his wife, Susan Coffin, to manage the boys. And apparently she was not very a good manager. The boys were able to break free from her by dictating a very long kind of letter, kind of Declaration of Independence. And that letter, interesting, was written, sent from Buffalo, New York, where I went to graduate school and spent 5 years. When I saw that, like, okay, great. The birth of freedom in some ways for them. And so they started continuing the show on their own by hiring a manager, the same manager who used to work for the Coffins, and now working for them. And we are talking about this Jacksonian age. In 1830s, America was like nothing like La Jolla downtown. It was kind of cool, fun, farmers market, a lot of entertainment and everything. Jacksonian age, because United States was a Puritan country, and the blue laws, banning drinking and everything. So the so-called entertainment, or as Mitt Romney would say, the sport. There was not a whole lot of sport. He doesn't say sports, I think. But anyway, a lot of European travelers, for instance, if you read their travel logs or diaries, they complain bitterly how boring America was at the time. The so-called sports will include like mostly tavern sports, card drinks, horse races, and cockfight was very big. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln are big fans of cockfight. And Andrew Jackson, speaking of Jacksonian age, one of the few kind of personal affects we still have that belong to Andrew Jackson was this tiny little recipe about, and he wrote this recipe himself, is how to feed the rooster before the fight. How it's like finely cut beef and pickle. That's his recipe. But anyway, so the twins then, traveling, they hit like every town, every village, up and down, for about a decade. And was very kind of gruesome business, on the road and being in a room, kind of apparently far more hostile than in this room, because the paying customers look at them as freaks, not really as human beings, or as Victor Hugo would say, calling the Hunchback of Notre Dame an almost human being, an almost kind of devastating phrase really to describe them. And but anyhow, they stood all the stare, all the gaze, all the poke, all the probe, and because some customers want to touch the band, and they wouldn't. They eventually got into a lot of fist fights with sometimes with the audience. For instance, in one Ohio village, and there was a doctor, country doctor in attendance. And the doctor, trying to show off his professional kind of knowledge, said, how about let me examine you in public right here. Examine the band to prove that you're authentic, right? And the twins said, like, look, we have been examined by famous doctors. Actually, when they first arrived in Boston, the first doctor who examined them and authenticate, them as curiosity was John Warren, who's the dean of Harvard Medical School. He was really the face of medicine in 19th century America. And interestingly, speaking of how dull America was, one fun you can have is to pay and watch autopsy in public. That's what the doctors would do on the side. They will do it like in a hotel room, like a boardroom, and they will do an autopsy, advertise, and you can go and. John Warren was very good at that, not just doing autopsy, but if you know about that part of the American history, he was actually the first doctor who used ether anesthesia in surgery. And before then, basically, you had to drink a whiskey, bite on something hard, and go through, basically pass out through the surgery. And John Warren was the first one who, learned to use ether. So he actually staged that as sort of like public theater, and with a hired photographer in attendance. Unfortunately, at the first surgery, the photographer passed out at the sight of blood, and they had to do it again. So restaged. And in order to convince the audience that there's nothing funny going on, Dr. Warren actually had to say, this is no humbug, gentlemen, just to make sure that's nothing funny about. So anyway, back in this little country, this little village in Ohio, when the country doctor said, how about let me examine you? And the twins like, no, we've been examined by Dr. John Warren, doctors in Philadelphia and in Edinburgh, Scotland, everything. Who are you, right? And so the doctor got angry and said, well, if you don't let me examine you, then you must be imposters. And that really, tempers flew, and they got into fight. The twins managed to get out alive at least, but they were actually taken to the county judge, and they're fined $200 for disturbing peace and everything. So they got into situations a lot like that, but they're also great entertainers. They know how to entertain the paying customers, and through this kind of negotiation. For instance, again, on a different occasion, some audience asked them, like, hey, do you guys ever talk, among yourself, between yourselves? And Chen would say, like, me, never alone. And so the second question was, like, how come you guys don't talk then? And Anne would say, me, no news. Because between them, there's really nothing going on, right? And then one of the audience members said, we noticed that Chang, your brother, pockets all the cash, your admissions fee. And Anne said, don't worry, me, rob him tonight. And so they know how to entertain and crack jokes and everything, which is a very important part of their repertoire, their entertainment. So anyway, they hit every town, every time. As a researcher, I felt quite fortunate that we actually have their very detailed ledgers, 2 ledgers still, that survived. And I spent a lot of time going through the ledgers. One ledger, account book, is called the money received, and the other is money spent. So they kept meticulous records of how much money they spent in this town, hotel, the inn, how much spent on watermelon, and everything, and then the money received. So throughout, reading, and that's why my editor got so impatient, like almost a decade, right, since your last publication, because I spent a lot of time going through these very minute details, and I was able to, formulate sort of like a Google map, entire United States, what day they arrived in this small town, how much they received, made, and how much they. So occasionally, sometimes they have a good month, sometimes they have a bad month. They really hit it big in the South. And the question is why? May have something to do with Southern Gothic, in a sense. If you're familiar with like Flannery O'Connor has an interesting saying, like she would say, to Northern readers, everything that comes out of the South is Gothic. Unless it's really Gothic, then we call that realism. It's kind of, a ball. I don't know that. Because later on, after a decade of going on the road, Chang and Anne decided to retire. They're really sick and tired of the prying eye of the public. And they made a lot of money in that decade, especially the last 7 years when they worked for themselves. The first 3 years they got ripped off, but the last 7 years they made a lot of money. They eventually retired to a very remote area in North Carolina, western North Carolina. And they first settled in Wilkes County, and they bought a 150-acre land for $300. So the estimate actually of their wealth when they retired was about $10,000. That was a lot of money at that time. And so, $300 will enable you to buy a 150-acre land. So you can just see how far your money can go in that area. So they built a big house in this place called Trap Hill. The house actually still stands today. The very house they built. And if you have read Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, you probably remember the very first sentence. Goes something like, a single gentleman with a good fortune, must be in want of a good wife, something like that. Or in the spirit of California, or being in spirit of a good partner, for that matter. But of course, Miss Austen forgot to consider what if the boys, there are two eligible bachelors, and what happens then? Well, this is one of the interesting turns our story will take, is that Chang fell in love after a party, a wedding party. He fell in love with a girl, Addie Yates. And Addie has a sister named Sarah. Anne was very interested in Sarah. And Addie and Chang hit it off, sort of. And they were going out, whatever going out means in those years, right? But Chang was tied to his brother, N. So they were trying to woo Sarah, like, how about join us? And Sarah was freaking out, was not interested. And three of them knew, without Sarah joining, there's no future, it's not possible, right? And so they came up with a brilliant idea. Again, it's like literally taking a page from Pride and Prejudice. If you remember, Elizabeth Bennet was the protagonist, and she turned down a marriage proposal from Mr. Darcy, and because she thought he was rude and he's a jerk, despite his wealth and everything. Until one day, Elizabeth happened to visit Pemberley, which is Mr. Darcy's estate, and she thought, wow, this man has good taste. It's like big mansion, and especially when after she talks to the servants, the maids and everything, everybody was singing Miss Darcy's praises, like he's a good master and everything. That's really changed Elizabeth's mind. It's like, well, maybe it's not such a bad idea to be a mistress in Pemberley. And that's exactly what they did, the twins. So, in order to woo Sarah, they threw a quilting party. Do you guys do that here in La Jolla? They do a quilting party. That's what they do in the Appalachian areas in those years, a party. Invited all the women in the area, and the twins, they're really well off in comparison to the other planters, And they threw a big party, had a feast, and they're also world-class entertainers. After being on the road for a decade, knowing how to interact with the audience, so they will crack jokes, going around and everything, and that really impressed Sarah. So Sarah was eventually thought in the same way as Elizabeth Bennet was thinking, maybe that's not a bad idea. You know, it may be fun, right? Especially the boys they were 28 when they retired from the show business. They're energetic, they're rich, and they're fun. They know how to play flute, tell jokes, and everything. So, except for the fact, you know, they're Asian freaks, and that's the only obstacle. They're not just freaks, but they're also Asian freaks in antebellum South. And that says a lot about the obstacle, you know, they all have to overcome in order to succeed in life. But then, of course, after the girls agreed to marry them, the parents, okay, that's the other hurdle, the parents. David Yates, the father, apparently did not like the idea. But the mother, Nancy Yates, is more complicated in the sense, Nancy actually is genetically has the problem of obesity. She weighed about 500 pounds, actually. The girls eventually, I have some picture of their later years, Sarah and Addie. I think it's genetic. They also, you know, were overweight in later years. So the girls were probably familiar with the very idea that one of their family members was an object of curiosity from the get-go. They are kind of not comfortable, but at least familiar with that kind of situation. So that may help the girls overcome this very kind of, you know, abnormally. But anyway, but the problem is, after the girls made up their mind, there's really not much the parents can do. It's an isolated area, and from the parents' perspective, that at least their girls will be taken care of. They're wealthy, and they're, you know, great gentlemen and everything, owning big house and land, wealthy. So they eventually got married, despite the fact federal laws banned interracial marriage. And that law, as you know, was not repealed until what, the middle 20th century, right? After Love versus Virginia, right? So anyway, so they got American citizenship, despite the fact federal laws went against that. They married two white women, despite the fact, again, there's anti-miscegenation law. So they overcame really a lot of obstacles. And then the next question is, they had 21 children, how the hell did they do it? So, if you have listened to Fresh Air, my interview with Terry Gross, especially the cut section, because we recorded that, and she kept asking me about how did they do it? Like, you know, who's on top, who's at the bottom? And, you know, like, how did they do it? So, well, so let me give you some facts and leave the rest for your imagination. How about that? I hope you're not here for that, just for that today. So the fact is, if you remember, I mentioned their band eventually was stretched to about 5.5 inches in length. And that basically made it impossible, you know, imagine the situation. If Chang is making love to Addie, N basically will have to stick around. You know, there's only 5.5 inches length separation. And so he will have to be literally and physically lying next to Addie. Okay. And writing this book again, after their deaths, the doctors interviewed the widows, and the widows claim that there's really nothing improper going on in the bedroom. But I kept thinking, like, situation, like, will there be like sibling rivalry? You know, will there be coaching? Like, if Anne watches, just witness, you know, the love making and saying, is that all you can do? Or, you know, like, how about that? And what about the wives, really? The sisters, by the fact they were sisters, will there be jealousy, right? If, you know, because they actually follow this very rigid schedule, is that for 3 days, they will stay in one brother's house, sleeping with the brothers. Let's say For 3 days, they will stay in Chan's house, and they will be in bed with Eddie. The question is, what happens to N, right? Will he feel stimulated, aroused, or pissed off, or whatever? Here, I would like to give you another example in comparison. For instance, later in the 20th century, there were another pair of Siamese twins, and Violet and Daisy and Violet Hiltons. They were very famous Siamese twins from England, actually, but they settled in the United States eventually. And one of the sisters actually dated a man and got married to a man and had a baby, whereas the other the other sister, remained single. And so I read their autobiography, their accounts. They explained that the sisters were able to hone this skill called alternate mastery, meaning when the sister is dating the man or doing whatever she's doing with the man, the other sister will just mentally blank out, a mental withdrawal, by reading a book, watching Netflix, there's no Netflix at the time, or taking a nap, for that matter. Kind of just blank out the other. So psychologically, it can be done. So for the twins, for instance, that's what they did. For 3 days, they'll stay in Chan's house. So Chan will be the master of the house. He will decides to do whatever he wants to do. And N will give up his free will just to tag along. 3 days later, they move on to N's house. And N will be master of the house, and Chan will give up his free will. And that's how actually for almost 3 decades, they stuck to this very kind of rigid schedule with very few interruptions, and they were able to make 21 kids. So, kind of phenomenon. But another very strange or more disturbing turn in the story is that earlier when they first arrived in the United States, they were treated like slaves, abused and worked. And after their marriage, the wedding, they became slave owners. And their first slave was a wedding gift from their father-in-law, David Yates. This woman, Afro-American woman, Grace Gates. She was actually born in a plantation in Alabama and then sold to North Carolina, eventually became a wedding present to the twins. 2 years after their marriage, Cheng and Anne started buying slaves. But they have a very interesting way, or I should say, kind of smart or business smart way of buying or trading slaves. They tend to buy very young slaves. So the first 3 slaves they bought was 2 black girls at the age of 7 and 5 and a boy of 3 years in age. They were cheaper than older slaves. And so basically they will buy these young slaves and raise them, use them in the household or in the fields. But when they grow older, they will sell them at profit. And so at the peak of their wealth, in 1864, during the Civil War, according to county records, they owned 32 slaves, at the equivalent of about $26,000. They retired with, like I mentioned earlier, only 10,000. The wealth, the value of the slaves alone stood at about $26,000. And in addition to land, they eventually ended up owning a farm which expanded to about 1,000 acres. But they built 2 separate houses on the same farm with a distance about a mile of each other, so they will not interfere with each other. So they'll move on in 3 days here, 3 days there. So when Civil War broke out, they were Southern slave owners. So imagine which side they stood. Of course, they stood with the South. And not just that, they sent their eldest sons, Christopher and Stephen, to the battlefield as soon as they turned 18. And they fought, so the 2 biracial bunkers, their sons, fought on the Southern side, Confederate side. Both of them are captured, wounded and captured by the Union troops, but at least they returned home alive. But the twins lost all their slaves as asset, and they also lost all their money. They got wiped out because they made a bad investment in Federate bonds. After the Civil War, they are worthless, right? And so they lost everything, basically, except they only have one remaining asset, which is their body, or their bodies. So they went on the road again, and after the Civil War, had no choice. They have a big family to support, with 21 kids, and with nothing left except for land, no more slaves, and no cash, for that matter. So they went on the road again. They had no choice but to partner with P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum and the twins actually didn't get along for various reasons, and I can go into that during Q&A if you're interested. But anyway, on their last transatlantic trip in 1870, Chang and Ann played a chess game with somebody on their cruise ship, Palmyra. And I did a lot of research. It took me a long time to figure out who that chess opponent was. And I can tell you that story later if you want. And that's the prologue of my book, is the chess game on the high seas. Chang, who's the heavy drinker all these years, who's in bad health, had a stroke during the chess game, which basically caused the decline eventually. They came home to North Carolina. Chang kind of recovered a little until one day he had a cold again, had a lung problem. The doctor said, don't go out because it was a very cold January. Very cold January, and Chang just had a cold. And the doctor said, don't go out, okay? But they just spent 3 days in Chang's house, right? And Ng said, brother, maybe we should just forget about this three-day business. The doctor said, you shouldn't go out. And Chang said, no, I'm fine. It's on top of that, we are in my house. I do whatever I want. And so Ng had no choice. So they took the last kind of mile of open carriage ride to Ng's house. And that really did Chang in. Chang died in sleep on a very cold January morning. Ng woke up and discovered that his brother was gone. And so imagine when Ng lingered for a few more hours on his own. The original plan was their family doctor, because they knew that Chang is probably not going to make it, or if he's not going to make it, the doctor is going to come and separate them. But unfortunately, on a cold winter night, the doctor didn't get there in time. And so imagine the few hours when Ng kind of lingers, okay, in pain, in cold. Throughout their lives, they did everything together. They eat together, learn to walk, and swim, sleep. The doctors even especially initially when they first arrived in the western part of the world, the doctors did all sorts of experiments on them. Like if you tap on the shoulder of the one, would the other feel this same sensation? The doctors even speculated they probably dreamed similar dreams because they saw the similar everything together. If not the same dream, at least variations of the same. It's like musical motifs. The variations probably. So throughout their lives, they're always two. They're always more than one. There's never, as like a medical fact, they share the belly button in the middle of their joint. Okay, so that renders navel gazing sort of moot, if you know what I mean. Something we like to do, navel gazing. It doesn't make sense to them, right? So they're always two. For Ng to suddenly to be free of being two, right? And it's kind of difficult to fathom the depth of that horror and the sense of loneliness, right? His mirror image is gone, or his shadow is gone. So if we look in the mirror at ourselves and we don't see our shadow, we something funny is going on. And so anyway, Ng died a few hours later. But that story didn't really end there because the doctors have been dying to solve the mystery of the band. And so the Philadelphia doctors, the minute they heard the news, they sent out a team traveling down to North Carolina. The doctors bullied the widows basically into allowing them to take the bodies, ship them by train to Philadelphia. They did 2 autopsies. and they also took out some organs without the family's permission or knowledge. And eventually wrapped them up and sent the bodies back to North Carolina, and that's why the joint livers today are still on display at the Mutant Museum in Philadelphia. If you go there today. And anyway, so when the bodies were shipped back to North Carolina, the Stephen and the Christopher, the two Civil War veterans, went to the train station to get their bodies of their fathers back, and they were shocked to realize their body parts missing. And but there's really not much they could do. And again, the story didn't end there either, because Mount Airy, North Carolina, where they eventually settled, built a farm, built 2 big families, and died there. Mount Airy, North Carolina, is also the birthplace of Andy Griffith, Andy Taylor, Andy Griffith. And so I spent a lot of time going around in that town just to get a sense. And of course, the puzzle for me was always these 2 strands of Americana, because there's really nothing more normal, sense of normal, than Andy Griffith. It's very white, right? Despite the fact it was a civil rights movement in the 60s when the shows were running on TV for 8 seasons. And there was almost no blackface. Despite the fact North Carolina, the black population was about 25%, really. Although in Mount Airy, strangely, it was actually only 5%. And even that, so the twins represent, I will call, the freakish aspect, okay, the abnormal and the freakish aspect of American culture, whereas Andy Griffith will represent the so-called normal, aspect. But if you go to that town, you will feel that the coexistence of these 2 strands. And their farm still is still in the house of the Bunker descendants, actually. And although today it has been kind of turned into, again, thank you, Maybury, has been turned into Maybury Campground. So when I was wrapping up my research and writing, I made a trip there. I drove down there. And because I wanted to spend 1 night there, from the get-go, I always knew that that will be the end of the book, the writing, because I wanted to spend 1 night there. Although the story took place about 150 years ago, I'm Chinese, so I believe sort of like a feng shui, the spirit of place. I just want to get a sense of how it feels, spending a night at Twins' place. Well, how it feels freaking cold. Because I made a mistake of driving there with a rental car, a Jeep Cherokee, and the campground was actually for big rigs, RVs, with a toilet, TV, and everything all set, comfortable as a house, like mobile house. But I wanted a rental car, so when I pulled into the campground, I went to the trailer, the office trailer, and the caddy, who's one of the Bunker descendants, very nice woman, who's managing the office, and she asked me, I said, I want to spend 1 night here, how much does it cost? And she said, how big is your rig? Rig? But anyway, she was very nice. She gave me a spot right next to the office trailer, which had access to the only public bathroom there, because I will need that. And so I spent 1 night there. I didn't bring any camping gear or anything. Once again, I only have a very thin blanket. So in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was freezing because it's up in the mountains, right? It's got very cold. Although I went there on the last day of summer, 2015, it was cold. But I get a sense of how it feels and everything, and that's how my book eventually ends with some reflection on Maybury and the twins, etc., etc. So I will end here, but I would love to continue the discussion with you guys through Q&A. You can ask me any questions you want. Yes.
I have 3 quick questions. Number 1, did you come across any research on how they treated their slaves?
Oh yes, that's again, like I said, also the disturbing aspect of this is that reports of they treat some of the slaves rather harshly. with them sometimes.
Number two, in terms of your research, did you find any psychological major differences because of their physical condition in them?
Oh, sure. Well, is the more temperate of the two, better disposition, okay, and more patient. Cheng, in contrast, was more irritable, but more acute in possession. And Cheng, like I said, also drinks heavily. And Ng is not necessarily a teetotaler. He takes his alcohol in moderation. But because they share livers, right? So when Cheng drinks, Ng will be affected. So Mark Twain made a big deal out of this. And Mark Twain wrote a humorous sketch called The Personal Habits of the Siamese Twins while they were still alive, actually, 1870. Mark Twain made a big deal out of their drinking issue, although he got it wrong. He thought Ng was the heavy drinker. But at any rate, and because they share livers, and Mark Twain said when one brother drinks, and the other brother will get drunk, but the other brother is only physically drunk, not morally drunk. So if you walk down the street and a cop is trying to give you a ticket, you say, I'm not morally drunk.
And one more thing, did they ever explore the potential to get separated?
Great question, actually. Yes, and that was always the question from the very first medical examination by Dr. Warren. Dr. Warren's diagnosis was that they can be separated. The separation might not be fatal, but could be dangerous. That's the 19th century verdict, right? But today's medical, through our medical skill and everything. Dr. Ben Carson, for instance, this is actually his specialty. Dr. Ben Carson, that's his specialty, is separating Siamese twins, surgically separating. But anyway, yes, the twins before their marriage, actually, after they successfully wooed Sarah and Addie, the brothers actually they consulted Philadelphia doctors, they wanted to go through the procedure, but it was the future wives, the sisters, who objected to the separation. Probably because they're worried, because it may not be fatal, but could be dangerous. They really don't want to lose their man. Although it also added fuel to the speculation, especially when the news of marriage, double marriage broke out. Just imagine, if you think fake news today is kind of bad, just imagine 19th century, learning this kind of joint double union. So the press went bananas over this. They called this bestial, right? Because they thought the two white sisters, normal sisters, were marrying freaks, or animals for that matter. So the fact that the sisters objected to the surgical separation really added fuel to the speculation that these two girls, might be perverted in a sense. They would rather choose to sleep with freaks rather than normal men, for that matter. So,
Yunte?
Yes.
There's our camera is stationary, but there's a gentleman who is a very good friend of a descendant of the Bunker family.
Wow.
Off camera, so the audio will pick him up.
I wanted to ask you, did your travels take you to Clinton, North Carolina?
Clinton, North Carolina? No, I have not.
That's where I grew up.
Oh, okay.
I was best friends, literally best friends. We played in a rock band in high school together.
Wow.
We've known each other since we were kindergartners. His name was Bobby Bunker.
Oh, okay.
We called him Buddy, Buddy Bunker. His father's name was also Bobby. And Bobby Edward Bunker, he was an engineer, textile engineer, went to North Carolina State and ran a West Point textile plant in my hometown. And I grew up with his son, his dad Bobby and his mother Glenda.
Wow.
And I didn't know if you've probably traced their entire family tree.
Oh, yes. Right. Well, so, I've been invited after this book, and really feel honored. I've been invited to their annual Bunker reunion this July.
In North Carolina?
Yeah, Mount Airy.
Okay.
Maybury, USA.
So,
Yeah, they're farm, actually.
no, I know Maybury very well because my father was actually a sheriff in North Carolina. So.
Wow. Andy Taylor by any chance?
No.
One of the Taylors?
It was not
Barney
fun.
Fife, for that matter.
But no, I was just wondering if you were familiar with the name Bobby bunker as one of the descendants.
Right,
Because-
not that name particular, but there are a lot of, you know, so,
Yeah,
I
Bobby's
mean,
in his 80s now.
okay, I see,
So-
yeah. But I've been in contact with, for instance, Alex Sink. Alex Sink, you probably should know her. She's a, she ran for governorship in Florida in 2010, and she lost by a very small margin to the current Republican governor, Rick Scott. So the Golden State of Florida could have gone through a different kind of, you know, experience with a descendant of the Siamese twins. So I've been in contact with her, and so she actually just came again, became the proud co-owner of Maybury Campground. Right? And she just told me over the email a few weeks ago, and I'm going to meet her this time in July. And Tanya Jones, who's the person who invited me, she actually is the chair of the Surrey County Art Council, who oversaw the Andy Griffith Museum, and she's the chair of the reunion this year. And she's the person. She's the great-granddaughter of whereas Alex Sink was the great-great-granddaughter of Chang. So yeah, the descendants today will count about 1,500 of them. Actually. A lot of them are still in the North Carolina area, but they also spread out all over the country.
Well, I can tell you, growing up and knowing the Bunkers, I never knew the relationship to the twins until in high school I saw that picture in an oval frame next to their dining table, in their dining room. And then years later I discovered their name was Bunker, and then it hit me who they were. But the family resemblance is also very strong.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Very
especially if you
strong,
watch
because
Alex Sink, for instance, and you watch her, you can feel the very strong presence. It's also the business acumen, because she started out in the banking business in North Carolina, very successful banker, and made her fortune, made her career before she moved down to the Sunshine State in Florida. And she was elected the chief financial officer of the state before she ran for governor in 2010. Yes.
Were they both left-handed or right-handed?
Oh, no, I'm pretty sure they're both right-handed. Although, I can give you an interesting fact. Later in the years, Chang, again, because of his poor health, he lost hearing in both ears, Chang. And slowly, was also losing hearing, but only in the ear next to his brother. So they still at least has one ear working, Just imagine if with the other ear, there would be nothing, no news there, right? This would be useless. So at least they kept one ear open to the world and help them, and which is kind of important, right? So yeah.
Were they known to be violent?
Known to be violent? Despite the fact, like I said, has a better disposition, they still have firing temper. So they got into fights with each other a lot. I mean, imagine your two brothers, with their best friends, we get into, especially physically, you're always in the other's way. And when they're younger, they always walk around with arms around each other. So if you don't know any better, you'll think it's just two guys, a little tipsy maybe, because the way they walk, it's kind of two guys, trying to hang on. But they got into fights a lot. I can tell one story, for instance, and this is kind of, you may know this perhaps. The sisters came from a Baptist family, and their father was also a priest. And the sisters, therefore, were devout Christians. But Chang and Ann, coming from Siam, even today Thailand is a Buddhist country, right, mostly, and they were Chinese descendants, and so they were more Buddhist than anything else, and they never went to church, but at least they respected their wives' religious beliefs, so they donated land on their farm and helped build a church, which still stands today. I actually went there and took pictures, and today they're buried in the church, cemetery right behind the church. The whole Bunker clan. So when they're building, and China really jack of all trades. They were hunters. They can ride horses together. They're very good marksmen. They fish, and they can, they chop woods together, they grow tobacco, and they also read, all sorts of kind of agricultural manuals to get ideas about how to run a farm, not necessarily organic, but at least kind of scientific farming. So they are very quick learners in all aspects. So they are also masons and carpenters. So they help to build the church. And one day they're working on the roof, and the two brothers, and one of them hit the other on the thumb, with a hammer by mistake, like holding it, bang. And of course tempers flew, and they fought, and they tumbled down the roof together. So that's kind of one example as to how, whether they have fiery temperament. Yes.
How infrequently are Siamese twins born?
How infrequently? It's kind of not necessarily genetic. It's mutation, right? Not very frequent. I don't know the percentage or anything. I would say one in about a few million or something like that. Yes. Yeah.
Are there enough documented cases?
Oh yeah, of course. Like I said, Dr. Ben Carson, for instance, who is an expert in all this. And perhaps we should ask him. He will know much better than any one of us here, the medical fact. Oh, yes.
How many children that each of them have? Because
Oh, yes.
Together they
Right, the 21, right?
Yeah,
So, interestingly, the first two borns, both daughters, they're born within weeks of, less than 2 weeks, 10 days of each other. And the same thing with second set and the third set. They always, they're very productive in some sense. They're busy. But Ng had 10, Cheng had 9. But unfortunately, Ng lost 2 daughters to TB, and they also lost 2 babies due to accidents when they're young, very small babies. And there are no Siamese twins in all of the 21. There were 2 actually deaf and mute, and they went to deaf and mute school in North Carolina, and that's about all in terms of abnormality concern. Yes.
Did you get to learn anything about how they were treated in their village originally? You can sort of take us from when they left the village, but...
Right, yeah. Well, like I said, they were pretty successful traders, businessmen. They're kind of savvy. In a sense, they exploited other people's curiosity.
So even when they were little?
Yes. So it's kind of important to them how to exploit, the other people's curiosity. So what they're saying, if, for instance, a guy like farmer's market, if you go through different stalls selling the same thing, and you see, standing behind the stall are 2 double boys, and kind of interesting, right? You buy stuff from them rather than from other.
That's kind of my question. Did they experience curiosity, or were they shunned?
Oh no, they experienced curiosity, and the neighbors were pretty friendly to them.
So interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in a small town in China. I can say a lot about that whole experience as to, especially not in the case of physical disability. I mean, I don't think China still doesn't have great laws really to protect or the rights of disabled. And but I was more kind of interested, concerned with people have mental issues, and to me even today that's still a big problem. But as for that, for them, because they're so unusual, and they were regarded as freaks, but they're also regarded as neighbors and human beings. So there's this kind of doubleness in a sense in our relationship to them. Is kind of sustains their curiosity, but also repulsion in some ways. And that's really their selling point, and how they manage to make so much money out of that. On the one hand, sensationalize, but when you come into the room, they know how to entertain you, talk to you just in a normal way, and that's probably how they charm the 2 sisters. Right?
Is there any evidence of husband swapping?
Oh, what about wife swapping? There's really no evidence. I don't think. DNA. Speaking of DNA, one issue related to slavery, right? At one of the reunions, 2003, there was a Afro-American woman showed up at the reunion. And she's the descendant of Anne Grace, their first slave. And she really wanted to know whether she belongs to the family. And that was only a few years after, Jefferson and Hemings' whole scandal right across the state line in Virginia. And so the descendants of twins who got very concerned. Some of them were very excited, some of them were concerned and worried. And so they contacted Newton Museum because when the twins were going through the autopsy in the hands of doctors, the doctors also did the cast of their bodies. And some of their hair got trapped in the cast. So depending when the hairs were pulled out, were there enough follicles inside which contain enough DNA for test. So I followed up on there was a frantic kind of email exchange in those months, but there was really nothing that will follow up, and that just went into a dead end. And my speculation is that probably the descendants were concerned and they didn't want to go through this, and because Aunt Gracie, who basically was the wet nurse to all of the 21 bunker children, she had 9 of her own. 3 of them survived, and all of them took Bunker's as last name, but that's very typical of slaves anyway. Doesn't really mean anything. But at least there was speculation, rumor, especially in the family kind of storytelling, that Patrick Bunker, Chan's son, used to play what's called half-brothers and sisters who are slaves. So that's the family story. And that really says a lot about, what might have happened over there.
Did they ever try to make their way home or contact family in Siam?
Yeah, very good question. That was my question, actually. During Fresh Air, Terry Gross asked me, if you were to meet them today, what is one question you want to ask them? I would say, I won't ask them how did they do it, but, like you say, whether they ever have husband swap, but I would not ask that question, really, because, that question itself says a lot about us, rather more about us, about them, really. Yes, my question was, how come they never went home? Because for me, as an immigrant, going home is very important. I'm going home next week, really, to spend a holiday with my mother. And so all those years living in the United States, they did get one letter from their brother, and they informed them, updates on their mother. Their mother eventually got remarried and had other children as well. So she's kind of moved on, but they never went home. That was kind of my lament and why. Of course, 19th century, going will take months. But even then, I think going home may mean something. But then there's the obstacle and the difficulty and everything, and they'll also have their family, growing family, and there's another more practical matters. Tom Thumb, yes, General Tom Thumb.
He smuggled himself into the U.S.?
He didn't smuggle himself. It's the P.D. Barnum who sent a manager to manage the show, and Tom Thumb will always travel with his mother. But he's only 25 inches in length. If we stand on the table, he's about this high. But he's a normal human being. He will smoke cigar and crack jokes. He will talk to the Queen, and the Queen, if you remember, the Queen will say, "Oh, you look a lot smaller than I thought." And Tom Thumb said, "Well, you don't like something on the top shelf either." He likes to talk back, and the Queen's like, "Woo! Oh, snotty." So, anyway, yes. You guys any questions? Yes?
When the Cheng and Eng were returned to their wives,
Mm-hmm.
or in their son, their family, their
Right.
wives and son, what did it look like?
What did it look like?
Like, was
Sewn up. They were sewn up. Well, the reason the wives would have to, they were facing very tough, they were in a dilemma because of the prevalence of grave robbers. Okay, those were the years there were not enough dead bodies for medical schools. So if you are a student, getting a degree in medical school in 19th century, one of the ways to pay your tuition was to go to a cemetery, know some new graves and dig up the bodies and steal the bodies, actually, robbers, and sell them to the medical school for autopsy and stuff. And so that's what their main, the wives, the widows, that's one concern. And the other is especially the Siamese twins' bodies. And so they were faced with the possibility, okay, they were to, if they, all they wanted, the family wanted, was a simple Christian burial, okay? But it was impossible for them to have that, because if they were to do that, actually, some of the family letters at the time, between family members, and they were saying, like, within days, our father's bodies will be gone. They'll be stolen by some showman, will be exhibiting in New York or Philadelphia for money, okay? That's one option, what will happen. Or because there are actually some businessmen, showmen, like P.D. Barnum type of people, approach the widows right away. Actually, one letter from New York says, name your price. Like, sell us the bodies, just name your price. That kind of tone. And or to have the bodies, go through autopsy by the doctors and eventually have a good burial and everything. So they face impossible options. Simple burial, stolen, or sell the body, stolen and put on exhibition, or sold to the showman, put on exhibition, or given to the doctors, donate, or sort of like donate, doctor, for scientific, knowledge and everything, and possibly going through the same thing again, but at least there's, there's some benefit coming out of that. So these are almost like impossible situations for family members. That's why the after story is kind of important.
How did they stop them from being dug up?
Hmm?
How did they stop the grave robbers?
Well, because they went through autopsy, there was great publicity. There's, autopsy reports were publicized in newspapers and everything. And eventually, especially after the frenzy was over. The frenzy, like right after their death, was just too much to handle with the publicity. It's like, imagine Singapore today, sort of like that kind of frenzy was just, so at least they quieted it down for after about a month or two, and they were able to, choose an isolated place. And today you can easily go there and visit them. Yeah.
The easiest thing to do if you're performing an autopsy on two guys who are joined, cut them in half.
Right, no, the widows, at least the widows negotiated with the doctors.
But that never happened.
Well, so, no. The widows basically, one stipulation they insist upon is that they will not cut them apart. They had to remain together. More importantly, that they can only cut from behind the band, not the front part of the band. But the question is, because of their connection, depending how they stand, what do you mean behind or the front or back? It's impossible to say.
Did the liver go in the band?
Yes. So
The liver was part of the band.
so here's the tricky part. They were actually, in fact, they were separated, right? Because the livers were taken out of them with the band connected them. So this doctor, the Yankee doctor, really, gave them a raw deal in many ways.
Did Warren, did he realize the liver was in the middle?
Warren was not involved in that.
No, but I mean from the start, did they realize the liver was between them?
Oh yes, absolutely.
How did they figure that out?
Oh, Warren did a lot of experiment. He put a pin in the middle, and feel it, and some British doctors also as well tried to see through, and that was impossible. They did all sorts of impact, including trying the, putting like have one twin, sip of vinegar, and the other twin how it feels. Kind of drinking is another way to figure out how they're connected. So the cause of N's death, for instance, also says a lot about the nature of the band. So they're basically, one speculation is because N was completely healthy when Chang died. So what caused N's death, right? One possibility is that he died of horrifying, being tied to a dead body despite the fact that was his twin brother. But more plausible explanation was actually this: because they joined, they're actually blood vessels inside the joint. So after Chang died, there was a mass loss of blood from N's body because blood going only one direction. Because Chang's heart stopped beating and stops the blood flow, and there was a evacuation, massive loss of blood from Chang, and that's why he complained about cold, like his legs are getting cold and everything, and that's how he died. It's massive blood loss, and that says a lot about the joint as well. Yeah.
What did you mean when you said
Gothic, yes.
Really gothic.
Uh-huh.
Realism?
Because their marriage was regarded as as a freakish thing, as bestial in Gothic. And the South, as you know, especially, so the newspapers, the penny press, in those years, the Southern presses were actually far more friendly towards this double wedding. They only thought it was funny, it's kind of extraordinary and unusual, but it was the Northern presses, especially the abolitionist journals, condemned this marriage, and especially used that as an example of how corrupt the South was, how the South was corrupt by slavery, and so its Northern presses were far more critical of this. So in that sense, it's Gothic, Southern Gothic. If you had lived in the South, you would know what it means. You got it. Okay? All right, great, thank you.
Thank you, Yunte. I'd like you to sign some books.
Yes, sir.
I'm gonna get this for you.
Those
I
are.
want to get it. I hurt my hand. I had a.
Yep, LIC.
Hit it last time I scored it.
I don't know.
Nope. Yep, LIC, A and then, yeah, my name is.
Oh, good, very good. Here, Dennis. What's that, Bill? How much is it? I can't remember.